I want to thank everyone for joining us today, whether you're watching or listening for this episode of Trader Talk. For those of you watching, you can see that I have Tom Sheppard joining me today. Now, Tom and I had the opportunity to talk, I believe it was back in December, for an episode of Author Talk along with Christian, discussing, training concepts, methods for their co-authored book, The Overload System for Strength. Slightly different approach today for Trainer Talk, where we aren't necessarily going to talk about a specific book, but rather the whole idea of in-season training for athletes. So I think this is an interesting topic, one where a lot of coaches have great ideas probably for off-season training and maybe preseason, heading into the season. But I think when we get into the season, that's where it gets a little murky, and maybe some coaches aren't sure exactly what to do. So real quick, before we get too much further into it, I know a lot of people see me on here all the time. And I know a lot of people are familiar with the work that you do, but just to give perspective on what we're going to talk about today, maybe kind of refresh everyone with a little bit of your background and kind of maybe some of the types of athletes or clients you train, especially in regards to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, sure thing. My personal training journey started when I was 14 years old. I was a 51 or 52 kilo, I'll try to do the maths for you, like 110-pound anorexic teenager. My oldest brother got me into it. From there, it's been kind of a constant obsession since. When I was at university studying biology, I did a lot, because of the way the university structure was in Scotland, which is where I studied. You had a lot of wiggle room with your modules and stuff like that. So I did a lot of anatomy, physiology modules, some kinesiology modules, all that type of thing on the way to my biology degree. So that really helped kind of ground me in movement and biological systems and all that type of thing. I also did an internship to become an S&C coach whilst I was doing my degree. So alongside my degree, I was coaching the men's rugby team, men's football team, a lot of the MMA fighters and things like that. Then straight out of uni, got my PT certificate, became just a standard personal trainer, and did that for about 5 or 6 years before gradually kind of working my way up the spectrum, as it were, to now where I'm working with Christian Thibodeau at Tib Army. Recently now moved to the US 6 months ago to start working in a more full-time capacity for Elite FTS as well, which has been another fantastic opportunity. So, being associated with people like that in the industry and companies like that really has allowed me to work with a very broad spectrum of athletes. I mean, I work with a lot of powerlifters and strength athletes, but I probably work with just as many track and field and sports and teams athletes on top of that as well, ranging from, back home is a lot of rugby and soccer players, whereas over here it's anything from sprinters to, American football and everything in between. So I get a very good variety, I would say, of people that I get to work with, many of which, I'm lucky to work with a lot of people that are functioning at a high level, which is always good fun. But, I always seem to attract a wide audience of clientele, which as a coach is great, because there's always stuff you can apply across boundaries that you learn from one population that helps you better with another population, and so on and so forth, which is why I've always tried never to kind of niche myself too hard into one style of training or one demographic, because I think we do have something to learn from all populations. And I think the more the fitness industry cross talks, the better we're all going to become.
And just real quick in regards to that, I remember kind of not a similar situation, but thinking in terms of training athletes, I primarily work with more like maybe middle school, high school, maybe beginning college athletes. But I remember I had a 70-year-old client, and I wasn't sure how I was going to cross over those two. And I was kind of concerned on, how I was going to kind of correlate the training between the two. But anyway, I realized that a lot of the issues that she was going through, whether it be shoulder issues from, long-term overuse, hip issues, back issues, a lot of those same things were some of the things that my athletes were also going through, maybe for different reasons, but we had to work through some of those same issues. So definitely agree that you can definitely draw from different populations to kind of work together on those. So.
I mean, even the first gym that I really worked at was, so back home in the UK, we have a chain called Nuffield Health, which they own gyms and hospitals, and they're very integrated with each other. So even like straight on the gym floor as a generic PT, you're working with people with knee replacements, hip replacements, all types of surgical implications, which really makes you think on your feet.
Yep.
But it makes you understand movement better when you're giving implications and limitations like that. You have to kind of know things from the ground up a little bit better. So even things like that, which you might think wouldn't apply to athletic populations or high performers or whatever, really does, because it makes you understand and identify problems better and how to work around them.
Yep. I think it makes everyone a better coach, a better trainer too. Once you're faced with dealing with some of those issues that maybe you never thought you would work with previously, prior to getting into the industry.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely think it helps you out and kind of makes you a better trainer and better coach. So I guess in terms of our topic today, we're talking about in-season training, and I kind of mentioned at the top, I think a lot of coaches are really good about the off-season training portion, building that strength or kind of setting the foundation. And I guess if we're thinking about this in terms of periodization, we might take athletes through a full cycle, starting with their off-season training. Typically, I'll have athletes, start with working in some stability and maybe working in some rebuilding from the season that they just participated in, kind of building that foundational strength.
Sure.
If they're in a situation where they need to add on more muscle, if they need to gain some weight for their particular sport, then we might work a little more through hypertrophy and kind of get that phase in there, but then really dig into that, everything they need in terms of individual strength that they need to gain and making them more athletic for their particular sport. Let's kind of start with maybe that transition phase and going from off season or preseason, kind of getting into their season.
Sure.
What does that really look like for you in terms of, making that transition and kind of, getting them into their season healthy?
Sure. I mean, a lot of the time that's going to depend on the kind of natural motor quality of the athlete. Like we all know some athletes are just naturally more coordinated and can transfer performance in the gym onto the field very easily. Others need a greater amount of time. But obviously also the degree of off season you get, if you only get 6 to 8 weeks or so, and that's going to change your strategy quite a bit. So in a perfect world scenario, usually for me, the transfer phase or the phase that's going to lead up to the in-season is going to be almost a pure transfer phase with a lot of complexes. So going from, like a attenuation-based exercise, something like a 90-degree pin squat or a block pull or a partial press from pins, you're working the joint angles and overloading the joint angles that are involved in their sport. And then doing a complex where over the next 2 or 3 exercises after that initial heavy lift, we get closer towards a sports skill.
Okay.
So it could be something like a squat from a pin to something like a hurdle jump in series to a sprint start or something to that degree. That would be the perfect transfer method in theory. The only downside to it is that it's quite neurologically taxing. So if they're an athlete who right up until they're in season still needs to be working on hypertrophy and stability and things like that because they just have a deficit there, it's very difficult to run that kind of method because it becomes kind of all-encompassing. Realistically, you're going to have 2 or 3 workouts a week where you're doing nothing but the complexes, and you're probably not going to have a lot left in the tank after that. But that would be like perfect world scenario, complexes of 3 to 4 exercises going from heavy accentuated joint angle lift to some kind of bridging exercise. It could be like a Bosch clean or a hurdle jump or something like that, to a near sport specific skill. And then if the athlete is advanced enough, then a genuine sport specific skill, like literally a sports drill there at the end, would be, again, the perfect one. You might do that for, say, 3 or 4 rounds. You could probably do that for an upper and a lower complex per workout. And you would do 2 or 3 of those workouts per week. And that would be your entire transfer block taken care of in a perfect world scenario. Now, if we're talking an athlete that has less time, or they still need to keep working on hypertrophy, stability, or just keep working up their strength, then we need to take kind of a less biased approach, which admittedly is going to get us less transfer. But if there's less to transfer across, then it's going to be less effective in the first place, right? So usually in those scenarios, what we'll do is, a normal workout for an athlete in the off season for me will look usually around 5 exercises covering the whole body. the first two of those exercises will become transfer exercises. So again, that could be something like a Bosch clean or a sled sprint start, something like that. And then we would keep in 2 or 3 loaded movements that are being trained for strength. Ideally, they would be more towards the end of partial lifts and things like that, so they carry over a bit, but it's going to depend on where the athlete is exactly. So at least in that scenario, then they get to do 2 transfer exercises per workout. So if they've got 3 workouts a week, they're still getting to do 6 across the week, but they still have enough training volume left to keep working on the deficits. And we would generally keep the transfer exercises first in the session, purely because they're the ones that are going to be the most kind of neurologically fine-tuned, that how they execute them is going to be the most important, if that makes sense. Like how they perform their medicine ball throws, their hurdle jumps in series and all that type of thing at that point in the season is more important than if they're doing their snatch grip high pulls in a slightly fatigued state, if you know what I mean, because those are the priority at that point.
And I think those are good points from my perspective too, whereas it truly has to be individual at that point.
Yes.
Where it can't be, you can't just have a blanket program for every single athlete. Maybe, you have a couple of athletes in to train at the same time and they play different positions and they have completely different needs. Or like you said, maybe they choose to train together, but they're at completely different points in their training age and their training career. So I think those are really good points. Where do you kind of balance though, kind of the training stimulus in relation to their sport practice? Because even if they don't have games, every day of the week, most of them, I mean, they're still practicing, 4 or 5 days a week too. So we kind of have to monitor that as well, and their fatigue levels.
Yeah, sure. That's why, I mean, I don't know how you coach them yourself, but like for me, it's always going to be a whole body approach, just because it allows them to get as much stimulus per session because our training frequency is always going to be very limited. Like if you get 2 or 3 sessions a week, you're probably pretty lucky, right?
Right.
So it allows us to get more stimulus per session. And obviously from a performance, if we forget hypertrophy and all the recent studies on training frequency and hypertrophy, from a performance standpoint, the more frequently we perform movement patterns, the better results we get, whether it's in strength or power or transfer. So if we go with a whole body approach, again, we're going to get better gains neurologically speaking. So that allows us to tick that box. And then in reality, a lot of the times, as the training practices are going to go up and the intensity of everything else that's happening outside the training is going to go up, what I'll do is the exercise variation will become more limited. So it'll become exercises that they're very familiar with or have been doing for a decent amount of time. So the coordination is better, the release of cortisol and the stress response to the exercise is lower, even if it's being performed heavily, and the muscle damage is lower because generally they're going to be moving more efficiently through the movements. And there will also be less variation between the sessions. So maybe they'll be doing the same movements across all their sessions in that week just to bring down the neurological cost of that whole training workout. And then also there will be a sweet spot where training intensity has to peak and then slowly has to start coming down before the in-season starts, like kind of where you're talking, where like pickup games and practices are doing this, but the season is still over here. That's also the best idea is always to get the most intense methods done by the time you reach that point. So if you're doing things like heavy isometrics or overloaded eccentrics or overspeed eccentrics or even things like depth jumps and things like that, like very taxing methods, that would be the time to try and have those done because by the time all those pickup gains and practices start coming in, neurologically, those methods are so tiring, it's either going to impact their practices, which obviously we don't want, or we're going to have to do so little volume on those methods, it becomes arguable whether they really bring anything useful with them because we're not able to do enough of them to get the stimulus that we want at that point. So that would kind of be where I pick on that is you're always looking at not just the games, but also obviously everything they're doing outside. And for me, the most stressful training will usually, if we do take an athlete, let's say gets a 3 or a 4 month off season, for me, like the latest you'd be doing the really intense heavy stuff would be like 6 weeks out. Ideally, it would all be done by more like 8, so that we can give them time to start picking up those skills and so on and so forth. Just to take into account that, and I think this is what gets forgotten, even practices have neurological costs.
Right.
Learning like we all assume, like we associate neurological fatigue with heavy squats, heavy deadlift, power cleans, etc. But like, have you ever studied for an exam? Like 2 hours of reading a textbook and trying to learn something is neurologically taxing. We all know how long you can actually do that for, like maybe 30, 40 minutes at a time. Yeah. So you take an athlete that's got maybe some rusty sports skills and is throwing 3 throws for an hour and practicing new drills and new tactics. If they're an American football player, they're going through new plays and they have to remember their positioning. And all of that is just adding on to that neurological stimulus. And I do think that just because it's not overly physical, that sometimes goes under the radar a little bit when people are taking into account cumulative fatigue, when if anything, that stuff is possibly more draining than the power and the agility work that you're doing in the gym that they've done 100 times before, that they could do with their eyes shut almost,
Right. And I think that's one of the things that maybe I struggle with relaying to the athletes that I coach. And maybe part of that is the difference in age. They are a little bit younger. I'm working primarily with the 18U age, but it's kind of stressing the importance of kind of managing that fatigue. And really, I might have an athlete come in and they're just like completely drained, both mentally and physically, and they don't understand why. They don't understand why they can't, hit the same weight on a deadlift that they normally do. And then I kind of think about what time of the year it is, and I'm saying, hey, you're getting ready for final exams right now. You're mentally exhausted right now. You've been spending so much time focusing on that in addition to practices, in addition to training. And I think sometimes that doesn't always get across the way that it probably should, or maybe they don't understand, what all goes into that. I like the analogy of, checking the bathtub. Make sure that your water level in the bathtub isn't too full, because if you try to add something else in there, then it's probably going to overflow, and you're not going to get the result that you want. So I would say for the age range that I'm working with, that's probably the most difficult thing, is trying to stress to them, like, it's great to, play multiple sports. It's great to come in and train all the time, and you're in school. But you at some point you have to manage all of that and realize, hey, I need to back off in one area or another.
I always find in those contexts, when we're dealing with groups, we always used to, and I found this so helpful. We just used to have a jump mat set out by the door into the gym, and every athlete who came in, they do 3 jumps. They would take the average of their 3 standing jumps, and you just compare that to their best ever, and also kind of then just put it on they type it in the laptop and whatever. And if we saw like a more than 5% deficit compared to the previous workout, or like 10% off their best, they just did a slightly moderated workout straight. And it took every athlete like 30 seconds, 60 seconds when they came in the gym. But for other coaches who are out there who are dealing with groups, that, or like you can get like digital grip devices. The first thing that goes when you have any neurological fatigue is peripheral nerve, so your hands and your feet, and your reaction time. So we've got all really high-end speed. So vertical jump tests high-end speed. Obviously, the grip is going to test the peripheral nerves, and then the other one you can do is the really basic, just dotting a pen on a paper and see how many times can you dot the pen on the paper in 20 seconds? It's obviously it's a bit rough and ready. So like a little quick squeeze on that grip device can give you just a look under the hood. Because they're going to come in and say, "Oh, I'm great," but that's because they downed a monster in the hallway that you didn't see or whatever, and they're keen to train because, like, well, if I don't train hard, I don't get picked. So you just have a squeeze on that, take a note of it, and if it's down 8, 9, 10%, you go, "Okay, well, look, whatever we do today, drop a rep from every set. Use the same percentages, or drop a set, or whatever it is, just enough to take the edge off so that you're not digging them deeper." Because, it's not always a case of whether you can trust their opinion. It's just maybe they're not educated enough to have the correct opinion and assess their own state of fatigue,
Sure. Definitely. I'd never heard of the pin trick on dotting
Yep.
the
Mhm.
pin. I might have to give that one a try though. What about what's your view on the complete opposite side of that, where some people might be getting too much stimulus, they have too much going on, and maybe this is just because I work more in the private sector as opposed to actually working inside of a school. But I've had situations where we get close to the season, and then maybe it's because the parents think that their schedule is going to be way too busy to continue training,
Sure.
and that's training is what they choose to cut out of their schedule. I mean, of course, schoolwork and practices and games are obviously important, but then it gets to the point where they're not training at all during the season, and then I kind of worry about, are they losing any of what they
Sure.
gain? Are they risking injury because they don't continue training? And really kind of what the effects are there.
Yeah. Sure.
Um, I haven't found a way around that. I mean, I can't dictate what other people's
Sure.
schedules are. I can only encourage
Yeah.
them. But what
Yeah.
have some of your experiences been like that?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a tough one, but it's almost, you have to almost take a similar approach to how you approach in-season training, which is,
Mhm.
if your sport trained everything adequately to keep you a well-rounded, injury-free athlete, no one would train in
True,
season.
right.
I mean, maybe no one would train at all.
Yeah.
Why bother if you can spend it in the gym or out on the court? Which one?
Hmm.
So your sport every sport is going to have demands that it does not directly improve.
Right.
But whatever that might be. Maybe it's hamstring strength or reaction time or what rotational strength or anti-rotation.
Hmm.
You could list off 1,000 things there, but no sport adequately stimulates all of the systems and facets
Yeah.
of performance that it actually requires for you to perform well at it.
Hmm.
And at the end of the day, if training at the end of the day, none of us would be in jobs if training didn't fill those gaps.
Right.
Because every baseball player, basketball player, football player would be the best player they could be by just playing it. So
Hmm.
yeah, it becomes very difficult. But for me at that point, if the training comes right down, then you just have to treat them like an in-season athlete and say, well, okay, like for the most part, we can maintain most physical qualities for a couple of months at least,
Hmm.
using about a third of the volume or a third of the stimulus that it takes to actually improve it in the first place. So that's where you have to maybe turn into a negotiator and say, well, look, rather than training 3 days a week, can you bring them in
Right.
once and can maybe for one slightly longer session, and we can do about a third of their total workload in their week in that one session, and that will at least be enough to maintain all the physical qualities that we've worked on in the off season. And also from an injury prevention point of view,
Hmm.
if training time goes down and playing time goes up, injury risk is probably going to go up as well. So then it allows you to do the bare minimum to keep their injury risk low, which is usually the best option to go at it from.
Yeah.
Like, okay, yeah, they could play 5 games a week, but how long are they going to last before they sprain an ankle or whatever, tear a hamstring, whatever it might be? My job is to try and minimize the chance of that happening. So
Hmm.
just give me that one day
Yeah.
to allow me to do that job where I can give them a bit more body armor or wrap them in cotton wool, whatever term you want to use, just so you can go and get them playing those extra games. Like,
Yeah.
unfortunately, it's the same with coaching anyone. Like, usually what's optimal is by here. What they want to do is
Hmm.
here, and more of the time you're going to end up kind of here rather than up here. And
True.
that is just the reality as a
Yeah.
coach, right? Like, there's also a motivational element to that as well, whereas training how they want to train makes them train harder. But,
True.
in here, a lot of the time you're going to get it's not even going to be the athlete's input, it could be the parents' input,
Hmm.
where you're going to have to bend over a little bit because they saw this on Instagram,
Right.
whatever it might be. And I know a lot of strength coaches are battling that now too. So
Yeah.
sadly, sometimes your goal is to just, you have to be here, but just try and make it as optimal as you can within the constraints that people give you. And that's frustrating, but it's all you can ever do.
Yeah.
But it's still a lot better than them losing them and them doing nothing at the end of the day.
I remember when, hearing an interview rather with Tim Grover. I don't know how familiar
Mm-hmm.
you are with him, but and he was referring to conversations, all the way back in the 1980s when he was training Michael Jordan, and um, everyone, and this is of course what I remember from his account, but people thought that he was crazy, that he was having Michael Jordan train in the middle of the season. And his kind of argument against that is he's a high level athlete. He is so busy, he's playing his regular season and then he's going to the Olympics, and then he has all these other commitments. If he isn't training in season, then when is he going to train? Is he going to get those strength gains? And I thought it was a good argument, especially early on, like we're talking about in the 1980s. Like we found out so much more about strength training and training in season since then. But I thought that was an excellent point, and he wasn't afraid to make that point at the time.
No, for sure. And for a lot of athletes, their in season is the majority of the year. So when do you actually get better? Because no one gets better in season.
Right.
At the end of the day, it's your job as a coach is to make them decrease in performance as little as possible.
Mm-hmm.
If you manage to maintain everything through the entire season, you've done a fantastic job. So like. Basically, what you're doing then is taking the same base level athlete in terms of physical capacities and just trying to fine tune them with skill constantly every year then, because you're not getting any physical increases. It's like taking the same Formula One car or NASCAR every single year, keeping absolutely everything the same and only being able to adjust the bodywork on it. It's like, well, if you just let us work on the engine and the chassis and the suspension and everything else, chances are we're going to get some way lower hanging fruit here. That's going to give us way, way bigger returns, right? And for some, that means that unfortunately their off season is going to be short, which means they do have to keep some kind of hypertrophy, stability work, etc. in season, because otherwise the window is so small that you're just not actually going to be able to make any meaningful changes. Because one of the biggest misconceptions, I think, in just the fitness industry in general is like how quickly you can actually gain muscle.
Right.
If you get an 8-week off season with an athlete, and by off season they're still practicing, they're still running and jogging or whatever else it is they're doing. They're not just a bodybuilder who's going into the gym 5 days a week doing 30 sets per muscle group, downing protein shakes and going back to bed.
Right.
Like they're running, they're practicing, so they've already got one arm behind their back a little bit. So what do you really think you're going to get in 8 weeks? Like, if you can put maybe a pound of lean tissue on them in 8 weeks, there you're probably doing really well, especially with like the demographic you're dealing with as well. Not only are they growing still anyway, you've got to get them to eat enough to fuel their natural growth and then the growth on top of that. So good luck with that. So in reality, there needs to be some form of stimulus in there year round for most athletes, just because there's going to be almost zero muscle gain. Because if you get, an 8 to 10 week off season, you're probably putting back on what you lost in season, and maybe a fraction more. So you're just spinning your wheels at the end of the day. You're never getting a bigger engine at any point there. So I think that's a great argument, and there are definitely ways of training some hypertrophy in season that don't have to hinder them in their game performance. We know so much now about like where more muscle damage occurs, like at longer muscle lengths and on the eccentric phase of the lift and things like that. We've got methods like blood flow restriction and all these types of things where we can get meaningful hypertrophy stimulus from very little muscle damage and inflammation. There's no reason stuff like that can't stay in. And even if it's only, half ticking the box of hypertrophy year round, that's still going to get them way more than if they only train for hypertrophy full on for 2 months out of the year.
No, I think that's a great point too. And while you were just talking just there, it made me think about how so many athletes, I would say, especially at the high school level, obviously it kind of tapers off and you get more singular once you get to college and definitely the pro, but just with club sports and playing year round, and you might have an athlete that is playing year round in one particular sport, but then they're also playing other sports mixed in with there. So then you're battling, like you said, you are in season all the time, essentially. So you just kind of have to manage their training there. So I guess in that, I guess one approach that I take is realizing if an athlete is kind of in season year round like that, then I will still take them through, a full periodization cycle. And like you said, just kind of maybe limit some of the phases so they don't get too fatigued or whatnot. How would you handle that though? Would you do something similar, or would you completely change up their training if they are truly playing year round?
If they're truly playing year round, in the vast majority of cases, a concurrent approach is probably going to be best, because you can't maintain several physical qualities at a high enough level without that kind of approach. You know, if you're going through kind of a phasic approach where, you know, you're going to do a hypertrophy block and then a strength block and a power block or agility block, you're spending too much time in a deficit where, you know, their power and agility and their reaction time is going to be lower, and you can't afford that at any point. Is concurrent the best approach for every athlete? No. You know, it probably is in some scenarios. Maybe athletes, for example, that have the need to have a lot of physical capacities at a high level at all times. You know, maybe we're talking rugby players and things like that. But, you know, there are definitely a lot of athletes, like more power-based athletes and stuff, where a concurrent approach is definitely not the best approach for them. But if they're in season all year round, it's still going to be better than underperforming in their sport for 6 months out of the year because you want to use a certain training style, you know? Because again, we get back to the what's theoretically optimal, what can you actually do? Your job as a coach is to get them performing as well as you can on the pitch. It's not to satisfy your own biases at the end of the day. So if a concurrent approach where they're doing a constant dosage of power and sport-specific work, strength and hypertrophy work and aerobic work is what gets them the best average performance all year round in all their sporting endeavors, well, then you've done your job. You might not like it because as a coach, unfortunately, you see all the things that could be better. And, you know, you see the theoretical optimal, but that theoretical optimal never happens anyway. You know, so I would totally agree with you there in that you can still periodize it where you have a slight bias on some of those facets. You know, you can still go through a power dominant phase, but in this scenario, in that power block, maybe power work takes up 50% as opposed to 75 or 80%. And you've kept that 50% aside to at least maintain and keep a decent level in terms of their strength and hypertrophy so they can still progress at a minimal rate on those things whilst you go on that. Like I said before, you can maintain a physical quality on about a third of the amount of volume it takes to progress it. So dropping those down by like half to make more room for power or strength work is possibly still enough to progress slowly, where you can obviously still go and get quicker gains in the facet that you assign more of the volume to. And, you know, that'll work fine, but you can't take an approach where you almost drop, you know, conditioning or hypertrophy or whatever, because they're just never going to be in a scenario where those things are going to improve otherwise.
And I think that's where it takes kind of understanding from everyone involved and kind of like maybe to a degree tempering expectations on the results that you're getting from the training, because if you have no downtime, and like you were just explaining very well, you have to kind of alter the training according to the schedule, according to the sports schedule or anything else that's going on. It's just tough to get the optimal results that you're really going for if you did have that full off season. So it's just so tough.
Yeah, it is. And, you know, it's very frustrating. And, you know, I remember when I was a PT, you know, and you talk to other PTs who you know, you're dealing with Gen Pop in the gym and stuff like that. It's so common to hear like, oh man, I really want to get to the point where I work with athletes because like, you know, I'm working with Gen Pop and they've got all these limitations. And it's like, it's no better. It's probably worse with athletes, you know, because like at least the Gen Pop person is coming to you because they want to be in the gym. You know, they've got a 9 till 5, they've got a kid or whatever it is. They have their own limitations, but the athlete that you're coaching, A, might not even like training in the first place. B, has a sports coach who you're probably butting heads with about who gets more of their time. And yeah, maybe they're playing multiple sports, and so you have to train around all those other sports-related variables now. It's like, it's no easier. It's more things to juggle, if anything. And I think that's a huge misconception when it comes to training athletes. People think that this athlete just gets handed to you on a blank slate and they're just like, do your work. And it's like, no, it is like the absolute polar opposite of that. So, you know, I wish everyone could see that before they got into it, you know?
No, exactly right. It's so much more nuanced than people might think, especially from the outside, if you haven't actually worked on the floor and worked in there. I think so. We've been talking for a little bit, but I do want to get back to maybe to kind of wrap it up, maybe more specific, kind of exercise selection and things like that. Maybe a coach, a trainer is listening, or maybe an athlete who wants to try to, kind of do a little more on their own if they need to. And maybe they're looking for, more specifics on maybe what some of those core exercises that they should really be focusing on it as far as in-season training. Like you mentioned at the top, you do have to get a little more specific, kind of manage your intensity and volume as you go through your season, and definitely when you're ready to peak. So for you, what are some of those core exercises that you might recommend in season?
Sure. So in season, a lot of the exercise selection is going to basically mimic what we see in the transfer phase, because the reason those exercises are in the transfer phase are because they have the best carryover to the on-field performance, right? So we're talking the squats from pins or squats from a box, block pulls, partial presses, whether it's overhead or a flat press, semi-heavy Olympic lifts, usually from blocks, because they're generally going to be better for power development. And again, generally sticking to the power variations of the Olympic lifts, or derivatives like high pulls and power shrugs and that type of thing. Yeah. Now, the benefit that also brings in season is, obviously, we're still overloading and training the sport-specific joint angles, which is great. But then we're also limiting range of motion to avoid loading heavily at longer muscle lengths, which obviously is going to cause more muscle damage, more fatigue, more soreness, which is going to take longer to recover from. Right. So it's going to allow them to keep moving heavier loads in their specific joint angles with a much quicker turnaround time. Now, obviously, we don't want to just spend time in sport-specific angles, because we kind of open ourselves up to injuries, and we want to maintain any mobility and stability that we've gained in the off-season. So generally what I will do to counteract that is put in loaded stretching in their routine. So, loaded stretching could be, for example, holding the very bottom position of a split squat for like 2 minutes total time. Or it could be, if you want to go heavier, maybe for a minute at a time with heavier load. But generally in season, although we can use loaded stretching for muscle and strength gains, we're primarily doing it to keep mobility and tendon health and that type of thing. So we'll generally err on the side of lower weight, more cumulative time. So something like a dumbbell bench press, where you actively pull the dumbbells down the entire time, weighted hanging, even like sissy squat variations, Jefferson curls, all of these types of exercises where we can take a joint and a muscle, take it through a full range, and it's safe to load it for an extended period of time in that bottom position, can be done once or twice a week at most, and maintain all of their mobility in those positions. And obviously is going to have a benefit there there's going to be a small hypertrophy benefit. The main thing you're going to get is really tendon development and health out of it as well, though, which obviously in season, when most athletes are absorbing a lot of impact forces, continuing to develop their tendons is obviously going to help them stay injury free and that type of thing. So the main kind of like chunk of their strength and power training is going to be partial lift from pins. There's going to be Olympic lift derivatives from blocks for the most part, just because they're better for power development. And in terms of percentages, we're looking at kind of like 70 to 75% for the most part, where we can hit maybe 1 to 1.2 meters per second if you're using fancy bar velocity devices. Loaded stretching would be in there once or twice a week, ideally after game day. Loaded stretching doesn't have a huge recovery cost. It's unpleasant to perform because you have to hold the stretch for 3 minutes. But in terms of muscle damage and all that type of thing, it's not great. But what I found is, if you take someone like a basketball player who's been pounding on the court for up and down for whatever time, the next day they do some loaded stretching for their hamstrings, their quads, and their ankles, whatever, they're just going to feel better straight away. And even if they do that in the morning, they can still play that night and be absolutely fine. And if anything, they're not going to be complaining about shin splints and sore knees and all that type of thing as well. And then most of the work that happens outside of those partial lifts, Olympic lifts, and loaded stretching is basically all going to be eccentric-less training. So lots of work on sleds, lots of loaded carries, and then maybe a little bit of what I'd call like structural balance work. So like some isolation work for muscle groups that are hard to stimulate. Otherwise, we're talking things like leg curls there, but they'll be done with a massively de-emphasized eccentric, purely because the eccentric is where most of the muscle damage occurs. So if we de-emphasize that eccentric, then we're going to reduce the muscle damage and reduce the likelihood that they're carrying a lot of soreness and stiffness into their games or their practices the next day. And we can use that exact same approach with all the lifts from pins. Mm-hmm. It can be basically a concentric dominant lift. So, power up and then minimal control on the way down, again, to reduce the amount of muscle damage that we get from it. But I think the effect of loaded carries and sled work, and again, sled work doesn't just have to be leg work, it can be presses, rows, even arm work if you really want it to be. Again, all eccentric lifts, the amount of volume a person can tolerate on those things is going to be double or triple what they can tolerate on something that's got significant eccentric loading. So when you've got maybe 2 sessions a week, it's going to allow you to fit a lot more volume in and keep their muscle mass, keep their strength with draining them much less and a lot less muscle fatigue. So partial lifts from pins with a de-emphasized eccentric, Olympic lifts off blocks in the 70-75% range, loaded stretching, loaded carries and sled work, and then maybe a little bit of isolation work for lagging muscle groups or ones that are prone to injury or just ones that are difficult to hit. And again, I would probably look at things like blood flow restriction training if you can for those muscle groups, because it allows us to get a good stimulus from one set perhaps, and means that the loading doesn't have to be particularly high. I mean, that pretty much makes up almost the entirety of my in-season training programs. And the end of the day, the goal is to get as much stimulus with as little fatigue as possible. It's not the time that we're saying, how do we put maximum muscle on? It's how do we only have X amount of volume to play with, and that amount of volume also has to cause a low degree of neurological and physical fatigue. So what are the best methods to achieve that? So partial ranges of motion, concentric dominant methods, and more blood flow dominant hypertrophy methods like sled work and higher reps, even band work are going to be better choices there, because it means they're going to be able to still perform whilst doing a meaningful amount of volume then afterwards.
Awesome. All excellent information, all excellent advice, especially for coaches and trainers watching this. Tom, I want to thank you for your time. This has been fun. Maybe we could do it again sometime.
More than happy to, anytime.